Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Now that the Alberta equalization referendum has taken place, the results are pretty clear. Albertans want a new deal on fiscal federalism from the Canadian government. Here to talk us through the implications of this is Dr. Bill Bewick. He is the Executive Director of Fairness Alberta, a national organization dedicated to educating Canadians about the magnitude of the contributions of Alberta to Canada. Bill, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I guess this is hot off the presses since the referendum was just a couple of days ago, but tell us your reaction to the referendum result.
Yeah, I mean, a year ago, I expected it to go a little more smoothly, but after a year of COVID and a few other factors like the declining popularity of the government that proposed the referendum, I got a little nervous, but I'm glad that some voices like ours were there to fill the void and make sure that Albertans, this really was a great opportunity to make Albertans and Canadians more aware of how unfair and why some of these programs like equalization are so unfair. And so that opportunity, I hope, will continue. And we're planning to take this to Ontario and BC and other provinces to make sure more Canadians are aware. But it looks like Albertans got the message and delivered a vote that we can use to help launch this issue on the national stage.
So how did your organization, Fairness Alberta, how did you participate in the referendum?
Well, we're a group of grassroots folks who've just grown tired of seeing how much wealth leaves Alberta every year. And then sometimes also get a little upset about what we get in return, both in terms of spending and support financially, as well as economic policies that are constraining our ability to be prosperous, and then sometimes just outright hostility from other parts of the country. So we are sort of tired of just, being grumpy about it and decided to put together a group that can do some analysis, raise some awareness in a more positive way, and really help Canadians understand how valuable Alberta's economy really is to the rest of Canada, and to stop thinking of Alberta's success as somehow at the expense of anyone else, when in reality, when Alberta does well, that really helps all of Canada.
So maybe just run us through your main messages during this referendum. I think you've done a couple of them already, but how did you express that in the referendum?
Sure. So equalization was one of the things we focused on over the last year and a half since we launched. But obviously, over the last 5 months, it's become the biggest priority as this referendum grew closer, and we learned that it was definitely happening. And it's, I've laid out a whole bunch of the problems that we did in 8 ways to make equalization more fair last summer. But over the last year, we've kind of narrowed it down to 3 big pieces that I think anybody can agree with and understand. One is that equalization the formula is meant to count all these different ways in which a province's fiscal capacity can be measured. So all these ways of finding out how wealthy you are and how much taxes you could raise. But it does nothing to address what the costs are or what the needs are in a province. And so when you look at the difference in cost between places in Quebec, places in the Maritimes, versus places like Toronto and Alberta and British Columbia, clearly they don't need to pay people as much. A lot of things are cheaper in there in terms of supplies and services. And so it doesn't make any sense to think that Quebec and the Maritimes need the same fiscal capacity, the same level of revenue generation to provide the same level of services. Trevor Toombs, a kind of world or a nationwide expert on this, and I've had some back and forth with him. And one of the things I pressed with him is, why isn't there some kind of adjustment for the cost of living in these different provinces? He has this big calculator, he added that CPI. And suddenly, if you just make a CPI adjustment for what the cost would be, Quebec's payment in particular drops from about 13 to about 7 billion. So getting in something for the cost of services is one. Another one that does affect Quebec is the way that they count the hydro resources there. Because Quebec Hydro's it very heavily subsidizes the power rates, which, Quebec, they can do what they want with their electricity, but the equalization formula should treat it as if it were sold at market rates. And when you do that, again, Quebec's rate or payment drops from 13 billion down to 5 billion. So if you could just do a few changes, then suddenly the payments drop considerably.
Right.
And then the biggest one is one that was put in when
We're gonna get to the biggest one, but we do have to take a brief break for commercials. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Bill Bewick. He is the Executive Director of Fairness Alberta, talking about the referendum in Alberta. And Bill, I had to cut you off right at the moment that was the most exciting part of this, the kicker, as it were. So bring us up to date on what else you were saying during the referendum.
Sure. The formula is also designed to grow with CPI. So the payments grow every year with CPI. Now, when that was brought in, there was a worry that Ontario had for a short while become a have-not province and was getting payments. There was a concern that the payments would go out of control if Ontario suddenly needed a massive amount per capita. So they put that cap in, but the cap is now turned into a floor. Since 2015, with the energy downturn, all the provinces have become much more equal.
Right.
So there's less need to equalize them than ever. And so if we just take away that rule, that also considerably drops the payments. And then it makes a few of these other changes massively reduce the amount that Canadians are spending. And people sometimes think of these payments as coming from trees or something, but they come from taxpayers,
Right.
and they involve choices that mean you can't spend on other things.
So I got to ask this question because clearly things were getting out of whack because circumstances change and different levels of growth. And as you said, provinces were becoming more equal. So why was this never renegotiated? Did Alberta try to renegotiate with the federal government? Did they not listen? What was going on?
Well, I think I kind of gave a clue when I talked about two of the most obvious changes mean significant reductions to the payment Quebec gets. And that's just a kind of political boogeyman in Canada. And that makes it a very awkward and uncomfortable discussion. But one of the things I hope happens from this is that this referendum coming from a province of people that are upset about it, and Saskatchewan has already said they're on board with these reforms. If we can get hopefully Ontario and BC, or at least people in Ontario and BC talking about it more, then it becomes a really awkward thing to kick down the road like so many governments have done before. And I'm not pointing at the current government, the one before. I mean, the Conservatives did manage to fix one of the big unfairnesses within the health transfer system instead, but that was kind of a trade-off. And so they renewed it as well. But it's, nobody in Alberta has disagreed that the formula doesn't need changing. And I haven't found anyone across the country that doesn't think the formula is broken. We're just using this as a kind of way to elevate the issue and make that uncomfortable topic impossible to avoid.
Yeah, so I'm interested in that as well because, I guess the name of the game for the province of Alberta is to seek out allies. You can't unilaterally change the Constitution yourself. So you mentioned Saskatchewan, you mentioned convincing Ontario. So take us through some of those arguments. What can Premier Kenney or what can Alberta say that will interest other premiers?
Yeah, first of all, the reason the question was put in the sense of changing the Constitution was largely to trigger a higher level of a duty to consult from the rest of the country. I don't think anybody actually believes 7 provinces are going to want to get into this can of worms. But changing the program doesn't require, obviously, any constitutional changes. And the reason Ontarians, I think, should get on board is they're paying about $2,400 per family of 4 to fund the equalization program. And that's a lot of money for each family. And what are those payments going for? Straight to the provinces of every provincial government around them to pay for their provincial services. And I think Ontario is in a similar position to Albertans right now, where we're saying we need those provincial services more than ever. We're tired of the massive debt levels we're raising. We can't afford to hike taxes right now. This is a giant pot of money that we are already paying in taxes. It's just that Ottawa is sending them east of the Ottawa River for the most part, and that does nothing to help us with our problems.
So, given that line of argument, are you What are Ontarians saying about that? Are you generating some interest in the discussion?
Yeah, we've been sending our Facebook boost, and we're getting a surprising number of people positively responding in Ontario. When I went a year ago to Toronto to just sort of raise issues around helping people understand how much Alberta's economy has helped fund the provincial government overall, there was reception. We got some good coverage in the Toronto Sun, but this issue is one I think I hope Ontarians realize that they shouldn't ignore this one anymore, and that it might be uncomfortable to talk about this with federal politicians and some of the provinces. But frankly, Quebec is getting a $13 billion blank check that we're paying for that they really don't deserve.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Bill Bewick, the Executive Director of Fairness Alberta, talking about the Alberta referendum. Bill, I guess, where do you think things go from here? I'm presuming you don't want to separate Alberta, although some Albertans do. You're looking for a better deal. So how do you see that process actually going forward?
Well, I do think people getting so fed up with the unfairness in the federation is leading more and more Albertans to consider separation. Right. It was one thing when we were paying a lot, but we were kind of getting to do our thing for the most part. And over the last 5 years, it's become increasingly difficult to see a prosperous future for Albertans, given the layers and layers of economic policies that are constraining our ability to be prosperous in the long term. And so if some suggested the federal government should just ignore this referendum, I think that's highly irresponsible and will only fuel those flames and lead to an actual crisis down the road.
So I'm throwing scenarios at you, I know that, but what if the Trudeau government ignores the referendum? What happens then?
Well, as I said, it's not just an Alberta problem, and if I can succeed, and if others can succeed in helping on the 40% of Canadians that live in Ontario and the 15% of Canadians that live in British Columbia, it's that's 70% with Alberta and Saskatchewan. That's 70% of Canadians that are paying heavily into this program, and for all the provinces, it's roughly $600 per person. In Alberta, it's more like $700 per person. But that's a serious amount of money going to fund the provincial services of other provinces. And, the federal government's just grown far too big and does far too much redistribution between governments. It's not fair in terms of funding the services we need here in Alberta and Ontario. And it's just, it's counterproductive in the long term because it becomes a kind of welfare dependency for some of these provinces. And it doesn't force them to take a hard look at their economies and find ways to be more productive, because they kind of can artificially get by based on these systematic transfers.
Now, one of the things about the province of Quebec, because you mentioned Quebec several times, is that, I recall François Legault, the Premier of Quebec, saying, when he was campaigning to be Premier, that he wanted to create a Quebec that did not have to rely on equalization payments. He wanted Quebec to stand up on its own 2 feet. I mean, is there an argument to be made to Quebecers that this equalization dysfunction is not really helping them?
Well, I mean, you could also argue that he's somewhat succeeded. I mean, as I mentioned, if you just take those Quebec hydro profits and account for them properly in the formula, Quebec's fiscal capacity is right at the average of Canada. Mm-hmm. They quickly become, they're not so much a have, but they're not a have-not. It's not a poor province.
Right.
They're running surpluses. Surely that is part because of their higher taxes, but it's also because of these massive transfers coming from the rest of Canada. So I would argue that they've succeeded and that this has become basically redundant. And because it's redundant, that makes it extremely unfair to be sending these giant checks funded by all Canadians to only select provinces.
So I know it's early days yet, but has there been any official reaction from the federal government or from other provinces?
No, and the official results aren't released until Tuesday because there's some municipalities have submitted and some don't. It looks like it's going to be somewhere around 60%.
Right.
And I wouldn't be surprised if they don't, because it's an awkward discussion that inevitably entails, laying bare the reality that Quebec is getting very special treatment, and provinces like Ontario, Alberta, and BC are getting unfairly treated. And so I think it's going to take maybe some more work with some of the provincial leaders and some of the thought leaders in each of those provinces, and just regular folks in those provinces saying, hey, why are we nickel and diming ourselves on some of these core services while we pay $2,400 per family of four to Quebec and the Maritimes to pay for theirs?
So 60-40, let's assume that's the basic result. What were the counter arguments to that? Why were there 40%? Was it just because it was a chance to bash Jason Kenney a little bit?
It was largely that. It was also many of the academics and pundits, whatever their core motivation was, they focused on the exact wording of the question and said it's not okay to suggest that we don't want to share with the rest of Canada. And then some people said, no, equalization is really important. But again, nobody said there's nothing to see here.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, here with Dr. Bill Bewick. He is the Executive Director of Fairness Alberta, talking about the Alberta referendum. Bill, again, I'm just interested in how the chess pieces move on this to get to real change. Are you looking at a change in the Constitution? You said at one point that you don't need a change in the Constitution, and yet equalization is in the Constitution. So walk us through that a little bit.
Right. The Supreme Court in 1998 said that, it was obviously a reference case on the Quebec secession referendum, but they established a few general principles, despite what some of the folks try to interpret that as. They said, any legitimate question, any clear question from a province on constitutional change triggers a duty to negotiate, or they also said in a different place, a duty to discuss. So it's common sense that if a province raises an issue like this and the people speak out loudly enough, the federal government would have a duty to acknowledge that and at least discuss it and see what can be done about it. So that's an obvious principle. But then another one is just that, we're running these massive federal debts. This program is grown $4 billion over the last 5 years, while the provinces have become closer and closer together. And now it's planned to grow another $4 billion over the next 4 years.
Right.
So it's just completely unaffordable. It's also become increasingly unnecessary. And again, with all these dollars going from taxpayers in provinces like Alberta, Ontario, straight to the provincial governments, and often to provide services that we don't even have access to in our provinces, it's just unfair.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I guess in a sense, with COVID and the massive work of the federal government in terms of direct payments to individuals to keep everybody afloat during the lockdowns, you could kind of make an argument that this program has outlived its usefulness, that if the federal government wants to help people, directly help them, you don't need this bureaucratic transfer scheme and weird formulas and so on. Is that possibly one of the arguments to be used?
Yeah, that's part of it. Another part of it is, I believe Premier Moe took a version of our idea, which was to, hey, let's just cut this in half and rebate provinces that $10 billion while we sort this out, because it's so bloated. Mm-hmm. He said, let's cut it in half and put that $10 million into the health transfer.
Right.
The problem is not so much that we're helping some provinces, it's that we're helping them in so many ways. Right. That it's become, Albertans have been net contributing $20 billion a year for the last 12 years. Yeah. That's about $20,000 per family of four. So equalization is hardly the whole story here, but it's the most obvious and flawed. And it's a way that we can start to bring down some of the net transfer happening. And why do we pay twice as much in taxes to the federal government as our provincial governments? They're the ones delivering the services. Right. They're the ones accountable to us for delivering those services. Why should they have to go begging to the federal government for some of these dollars all the time when they're the ones that are responsible for delivering provincial jurisdiction? So it'd be nice to have a rethink and just get everybody to realize that the federal spending power and the federal tax room are just large and inefficient and inherently unfair, because the wealthier provinces will always be paying a premium every time the federal government expands a program. Pharmacare's next, and childcare. Albertans and Ontarians and British Columbians are going to be paying 5, 6, 10% more than they're ever going to get back in those programs. So why can't we just send 50% of our taxes to the provincial government and 50% to the feds, and let the provincial governments have the resources to meet their responsibilities?
We've got just 20 seconds left. Are you optimistic that this can go somewhere?
I am, but I also know it's going to be a bit of an uphill battle. So I would love it if anybody who wants to support what we're doing, especially in places like Ontario and BC, go to fairnessalberta.ca, find us on Facebook and reach out, because we'd love to start building some alliances so that when we show up there, we can have some support and get this ball rolling right across the country.
Bill Bewick, thanks for joining us today. Very interesting discussion.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to thank Dr. Bill Bewick of Fairness Alberta. Really interesting discussion in the wake of the Alberta referendum and what happens next. You know, the dust is starting to settle on this, but it looks like there's going to be lots of negotiations on taxes and on fairness between provinces, which affects all of you. Wherever you live in Canada, this is going to affect you. So thanks for watching.